Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Xi Jinping has a narrow window of opportunity. Donald Trump has made it clear that he might not come to Taiwan's defense in a conflict with China, leaving Beijing perhaps with an incentive to strike within the next 4 years. Is Taiwan ready for it? Lev Nachman is an assistant professor at National Taiwan University in Taipei. Hello and welcome, Lev.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. 7 a.m. there, very early for you, late for us. So, but great timings with people in Australia. So we're very appreciative. Thank you very much. Just to start with, Lev, just say a few words about yourself, and then we'll jump into it.
Yeah, great. I'm a political scientist by training. I teach in the Graduate Institute of National Development here at National Taiwan University. I teach mostly Taiwanese politics, cross-strait relations, and U.S.-Taiwan relations. I've been doing research in Taiwan for over a decade. Most of my research focuses these days on public opinion, both in Taiwan and the United States, about how people see the future of Taiwan, how people see U.S.-Taiwan relations, and a cross-strait conflict. In the past, my work was largely focused on civil society here in Taiwan and Taiwanese domestic politics, but my work is currently focused sort of on a more how the domestic here in Taiwan affects the global.
Great. And later this year, we are going to be seeing you on our political tour of Taiwan, which takes place in October. So we're really looking forward to seeing you on that. Can you just describe what the reaction has been, what the press coverage has been in Taiwan of the events in Washington, and notably Trump's ill-fated meeting with Zelensky, and then, of course, the suspension of arms deliveries to Ukraine?
So there's been a lot of concern, to say the least. If there's one place in the world that Taiwan has been watching more than ever before, it's Ukraine. Arguably, the war in Ukraine has sort of caused sort of a seismic shift in civil society here in Taiwan, where it didn't affect just public opinion, but it really sort of changed how people approach the idea of readiness, of conflict, and it made the idea of a conflict feel much more real. And so ever since Ukraine, people in Taiwan have just been paying attention to sort of geopolitics in a different way. And naturally, the debacle in the Oval Office was something that was seen here. And it's something that I think has caused concern sort of across political spectrums here in Taiwan. So, ever since the last couple of years, since Ukraine started, there's been this phenomenon in Taiwan that we call American skepticism. The idea that maybe America isn't the ally we think it is. And American skepticism has largely been partisan, meaning that you're more likely to be blue-leaning, blue in Taiwan meaning more aligned with the KMT, green aligned meaning more aligned with the DPP. So those aligned with the KMT, those are blue-leaning, tend to be more susceptible to this American skepticism. But the concern is that now, because of Trump's actions, this American skepticism could be a little bit more widespread. Now, of course, just in the last 48 hours, we've had a new announcement about this TSMC investment, and whether or not this TSMC investment in the United States is going to have an effect on these questions about whether or not we think the United States is a reliable ally or not, I think is also something we're all willing to see.
Just to jump in there, that's the Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, which obviously is the global leader in the production of semiconductors, making Taiwan a huge strategic asset to global trade and obviously, of course, the United States.
Yeah, if you've ever read a story about semiconductors in Taiwan, it's probably about TSMC.
Yeah. Okay.
So these issues about how has the question about supporting Ukraine affected Taiwan? I think it's a very, very fresh thing. So I'm running a survey right now to hopefully be able to better understand it, because every time we have a major event like this, it sort of causes us to need more public opinion data, because it's going to actually have a very meaningful shift.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you've described that there's that interest, and you described the rise in skepticism about the United States' ability to act. But I don't really get a sense of real concern and worry. I'm trying to estimate, if you were Ukrainian, you were clearly, my God, this is really a serious problem for us. But I'm not getting a sense of quite how worried the Taiwanese are.
Yeah, so concern for military conflict has actually existed for years, and it predates Ukraine. So there's often this common wisdom that Taiwanese people are apathetic or that they don't care about the idea of conflict with the PRC. And our public opinion research shows that's not true. We've been asking for years whether or not you think the odds of conflict are increasing or decreasing, and overwhelmingly people show that they think that these odds are increasing. And when asked about, are you concerned about specifically conflict with the PRC, more and more people are saying yes. This is based off of my own public opinion research that's actually available at Brookings for anyone who's interested. Now, the difference is, and this is sort of where the disconnect happens, is because threats from the PRC, military threats in particular from the PRC, are such a regular occurrence in Taiwan, people here don't run in the street screaming and panicking every time that there's fighter jets flying near Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Now, that might seem obvious because, well, in Taiwan, it's very much a boy who cried wolf scenario, where if it happens every single day, people aren't going to necessarily, run and panic every single time it happens. But that disconnect is meaningful because for a lot of people who don't live in Taiwan and only ever see sort of the very dire headlines in the media, would think that, oh, well, people in Taiwan must be, running around in the street every single day, panicked and feared nonstop. And that's not true. People in Taiwan continue to live their lives anyway, in spite of being very concerned about war and conflict coming in the future.
So was last week just another week in sort of scares about the possible increased conflict, or do you think there's a real shift in tone?
So that unfortunately is an excellent empirical question that as public opinion people are trying to better understand.
Well, okay,
but there's
I know that you want to stick to scientific data, but come on, I want you to give me a personal reading, and I'm not talking about data, I'm not talking about opinion polls, a personal reading of what you thought happened last week.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's reasonable to suspect that there's going to be a change in attitude because of what happened last week. But unfortunately, again, it's one of those things where because TSMC happened immediately after it, the way that news cycles last in Taiwan, it's going to be a matter of whether or not we see which one of these stories,
we'll come on to that in a second. Basically, the idea is that if the TSMC invests in the United States is going to be more interested in defending Taiwan. That's the rough idea. We'll come back to that in just a second. But can we just explain, for those who don't know, the Taiwan Relations Act? What has been until now the US strategy towards the defense of Taiwan?
Yeah, so the US-Taiwan Relations Act is defined largely by the document, the Taiwan Relations Act, but also underlines both the 6 assurances, the 3 communiques, and sort of this larger history of how the United States switched recognition decades ago from the PRC to the ROC, in which it would no longer recognize the ROC, Taiwan, as a country. However, it would still maintain a healthy trading relationship and that it would still be helping the ROC supply military weapons of a defensive nature. And it's that last part of a defensive nature that's very important because the guiding principle for what the United States has been selling Taiwan has not been one of aggression. It's really been more about selling military equipment that can defend so that Taiwan can defend itself. Now, of course, there have been changes to, this act. There's been more robust policies that have passed over the years that sort of increase the amount of military technologies being sent to Taiwan or sold to Taiwan. But these are sort of the underlying principles that have sort of guided how the United States approaches Taiwan over the last few decades. Now, the term that everyone at least the question that everyone is deeply concerned with is whether or not the United States would actually come to Taiwan's aid in the event of a military conflict with the PRC. Now, this question is one that often gets sort of entangled in these questions of what we often call strategic ambiguity. So strategic ambiguity often gets misconstrued. A lot of people think that strategic ambiguity is about the United States never really saying specifically whether or not they would or would not. And that's not really the point. The point of strategic ambiguity is more about under what conditions would the United States get involved in a military conflict. So the usual explanation is that if the PRC acts unilaterally, unprovoked, to attack Taiwan, then the odds of the United States defending Taiwan are very high. If Taiwan unilaterally declares independence or unilaterally takes action to change the status quo on its own accord, then the United States is perhaps less likely to intervene. All the United States' policy is mostly about trying to maintain the status quo. And so when we think about strategic ambiguity, it's not about being strategically, we're never going to say if we are or not. It's about defining under what conditions we're actually going to take action.
The question I was asking was, what do we know about Donald Trump's attitudes towards Taiwan from his previous term in office, but also during the campaign, and also possibly the statements he's made in the last few weeks?
So if there was one word to just sort of describe it, I would say inconsistency. During his time in office, during his first administration, we saw both signs that he was very friendly to Taiwan and signs that he was very friendly with the PRC. So on one hand, you have, perhaps the infamous phone call that he took from Tsai Ing-wen in 2016, but you also have a lot of rhetoric coming from him about how Xi Jinping is his good friend, who he respects so much and admires Xi Jinping's work as a leader. And it's really later in his administration under Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State and Matt Pottinger that we see sort of a robust increase in U.S.-Taiwan relations. And a lot of this is also sort of comes during the time of COVID, when there's a lot more animosity between the United States and the PRC. And so, leaving office, the perception was that Donald Trump, at least the perception in Taiwan, was that Donald Trump was very strong for Taiwan. Now, we had 4 years of Biden, and if of interest, I'm happy to talk about how Taiwan saw Biden and the Democratic Party. But during the last presidential election, people were not nearly as sold on Donald Trump here because of a lot of the language that was coming out on Taiwan from Donald Trump. There was a lot of sort of very harsh language from Trump about how much Taiwan has been spending on defense, and Donald Trump demanding that Taiwan spend 10% of its GDP on defense, which that's not a real number. That's ridiculous. Or the idea that Taiwan stole America's semiconductor manufacturing, which is empirically not true. And a lot of this caused concern in Taiwan, combined with, Trump's continued sort of praise of Xi Jinping. And so what we saw in the lead up to the election was also just a lot of uncertainty coming out from who was going to be in charge of sort of foreign affairs, who's going to be Secretary of State. And then, of course, what role was Elon Musk going to have? Because Elon Musk's attitudes towards Taiwan and China are also not particularly popular here in Taiwan. Elon Musk has said verbatim that he thinks Taiwan should accept a one country, two systems style approach like Hong Kong, which polls show in Taiwan that one country, two systems is dead on arrival in Taiwan. No one wants it. So when Trump took office the second time and we saw that it was going to be both Marco Rubio and Elon Musk sort of trying to fight for Donald Trump's foreign policy here, it led to a sort of a level of uncertainty here about what exactly we were going to see from Donald Trump. And lo and behold, we've seen sort of a lot of confusion. On one hand, Marco Rubio will pay lip service to how important Taiwan is, but Donald Trump is happy to threaten tariffs as much as he can in order to try to strike a deal with semiconductor industries here in Taiwan. And combined with sort of the rhetoric around Ukraine last week, it sort of led to a lot of uncertainty. Again,
considerable uncertainty, very worrying, and presumably in the back of people's minds, the question of whether or not the United States would step in as it previously is committed to. Where does the semiconductor business deal come in? How does that work? What's been offered?
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that this wasn't some massive deal that like TSMC thought of overnight and sold to Donald Trump. If you've been following the story of semiconductors in Taiwan, you know that investment in Arizona has been an ongoing project for years. It started, well before Donald Trump's time. The CHIPS Act that was passed under Biden was really something that sort of incentivized investment by TSMC. And so most of the deal that we're seeing from TSMC was actually going to happen. It was already in the cards. And a lot of this initial investment planning was already sort of underway. The deal that we saw yesterday was a slight expansion of what was already planned and also an increase in the timeline. So essentially what we're seeing was mostly a sped up version of what we were expecting to see from TSMC at some point under the Donald Trump administration. The current sort of working argument people are making is that what we saw in the Oval Office with Zelensky was sort of a incentive for TSMC to hurry up its expansion with its deal for the sake of appeasing Donald Trump. But There's been efforts by TSMC to heavily invest in the United States for quite some time because of the CHIPS Act that Biden passed. So, of course, I think Donald Trump is going to take full credit for all of this, but it's worth sort of keeping a bit of a long durée approach of looking at just how long this sort of plan by TSMC has been going, which should not make the investment seem small. It's a very big investment. But the hope is that it is enough, at least for now, to sort of stave off Trump's threats of 25% tariffs. Okay.
I wanted to switch now back to Taiwanese internal politics and the blues and the greens. Is there has there been a voice within Taiwan for a rapprochement with China, a sense that, even one country, two systems might be a possibility? I'm just trying to get us any sense that if there is a body of opinion that is influential enough to engage with China.
So there's a difference between wanting to engage with China and then wanting one country, two systems. Yeah. So, it's very important to keep in mind that, when we think about engagement with China, what that means for different parties is important. So when we look at, say, the KMT and the DPP, the two biggest parties in Taiwan right now, both parties will say that they are pro-status quo. And that's largely true. Neither the DPP or the KMT have actually proposed any policy that is actively going to change Taiwan's constitution or change Taiwan's status within the Taiwan Strait. So that then begs the question, how are they different? How are they both status quo parties? And it's particularly how they see relations with the PRC that changes their approach to the status quo. So the DPP's approach has been that we need diversification in our political partners and our economic trading partners. Their approach is not to cut off from the PRC, but rather that we need to put our eggs in lots of different baskets. And by diversifying, that will help Taiwan maintain its autonomy as this sort of de facto independent state. The KMT's approach to the status quo is that we need to put our eggs more in the basket with the PRC, because the better relations we have with the PRC, the more likely they are to let us exist in our sort of de facto independent state. Both of those are trying to maintain the status quo, just with two very different strategies and two very different approaches to how to deal with the PRC. But it's worth knowing that in Taiwan, unification with the PRC is incredibly unpopular. It's less than 3% of people want it. It's a dead electoral strategy. People in Taiwan overwhelmingly want the status quo. Every single piece of public opinion research shows this overwhelmingly, repeatedly, year after year. And it's the question we poll almost every day. So
Xi Jinping has made two things very clear. One is that he would like unification to take place by 2040, I think. And also that the People's Liberation Army should be in a position to be able to take Taiwan militarily, if necessary, by force, by 2027. Added to that, there is now a president in the White House who is ambiguous about the defense of Taiwan. Do people have a sense, and again, I don't want to go to sort of opinion polls too much, but in terms of military strategists, in terms of people who are analyzing the military situation, is there a sense that this conflict is a potentially very real and imminent?
I think it's certainly potentially very real. I think that's the unknown question that everyone wants to better understand, is whether or not Xi Jinping is going to look at the current Trump administration and say, you know what, if we were to strike now, no one's going to stop us, so let's strike now. Or if they would say, you know what, this is going to play out where the United States' power slowly declines and Europe's power slowly declines, there's no rush. Why rush it? Because currently the PRC is not particularly popular in Taiwan. So why try to invade an island that we're not very popular in yet? And instead, if we know that it's going to be ours for the taking in the future, then let's just wait it out for a better condition. That's sort of the rational actor approach. And, I think many of us in my world see Xi Jinping as a relatively more rational actor than say, Donald Trump. So from Xi's perspective, there's good reason to wait, because why attack now when attacking later would be so much cheaper, both, in terms of actual cost, but also political costs.
And in terms of Taiwan's military capacity, what exists without the United States?
So Taiwan has been heavily investing in trying to, sort of rebrand its military ever since the second Tsai administration. Tsai Ing-wen's second term was largely defined by trying to improve relations with MND, between the DPP and MND, and to sort of try to help civil society have a better image of the military. The military of Taiwan is often seen in an incredibly partisan way because of historically the military was the brutal authoritarian party's military who was responsible for a lot of violence in Taiwan, which meant that a good, a third plus of Taiwan's civil society didn't really see the military in very favorable light. But Tsai Ing-wen tried her best to sort of change that. And so, for quite some number of years now, there's been attempts to sort of see the military less in sort of this pan blue light, and instead of sort of being the force that's trying to defend Taiwan. Now we've seen that sort of effort become expanded with the 1-year military conscription extension. So all men in Taiwan are required to serve in the military. It was previously 4 months. It's now 1 year. And that's been an attempt to try to also sort of boost people's perception. The way that people are trained is also being changed and updated. And now it's just a matter of, whether or not this increase in time that people are spending during their conscription, along with the new kinds of training, is going to have the kind of intended effect in terms of people's willingness to fight, which is a whole other can of worms that I'm happy to talk about.
Okay, well, let's talk about that in just a second. I would like to get questions, please. If you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or just raise your hand. If you press the hand button on the screen, we'll come to you, and then you can put your questions directly to Lev. So, Lev, what are the different possible scenarios? People have there are regular war games on both sides. This is the scenarios that are played out. The war games have played out again and again and again. What are the possible scenarios?
So for anyone interested in sort of the best, war game scenario work, CSIS has an excellent report about all the conditions that people think would play out in the event of a conflict. There's only really sort of one imperative hypothetical that matters, and that is whether or not the United States is going to get involved in the conflict, because so much is largely contingent upon the United States' involvement. So research overwhelmingly shows that whether or not people in Taiwan are going to pick up a gun and go fight, or whether or not they feel enthusiastic about Taiwan's odds, is largely dependent on whether or not they think the United States is going to be involved. So that relative number of how likely am I to want to also get involved in civil defense goes down if the United States is not coming. So really, that's what matters most is whether or not we know the U.S. is coming or not. Now, of course, the challenge is the United States doesn't say directly whether or not they're going to come or not.
Forgive me, Lev. Forgive me. We're talking about a public opinion there, but my question was really more orientated around military, in terms of military tactics. There's very obvious that two possibilities. One is siege. You surround the island. You cut it off from all international shipping contact. And stand back and see what happens, or invasion. I wonder if you can explore those possibilities.
Yeah, so those aren't really sort of the two that people think about these days. The question people think about is actually questions more of blockades more than anything, because that's really sort of the thing that Taiwan is prepping for the most. So because of logistically, it's actually not really possible for Taiwan to sort of send ships and land on Taiwan. There's only a number of beaches that can actually be landed on in Taiwan. And those beaches are being monitored very closely every day. It's essentially the Coast Guard's one job is to watch these beaches that we know that can be landed on. Instead, what people are more invested in trying to understand is sort of this spectrum of blockades. So we have soft blockades, we have hard blockades, and we have quarantines. And these are sort of really what people are invested in. So rather than sort of just again, bombing Taiwan serves no real purpose, because you're supposed to want the people on the island to love you. And instead, what a blockade would be able to do would be to sort of show the PRC's power and show Taiwan's defenselessness of the government without really sort of directly trying to fire any bullets. So, when we saw, say, the drills that happened under Nancy Pelosi back in 2022, we see those as blockade drills. Those weren't necessarily fighting drills with a sense of trying to go to war. Instead, it was about trying to sort of stop goods from coming in and out of Taiwan. Now, they didn't actually do that, but that was sort of how we see the intent actually playing out. So what the main scenarios that people are trying to work through are these various levels of blockade. So when I say quarantine, soft blockade, hard blockade, you should imagine these things on a spectrum. So a quarantine is just the PRC sort of stopping ships and inspecting their goods as they come through. A soft blockade is stopping some goods and not others. And then a hard blockade is sort of stopping everything. And these are the different kinds of scenarios that people are thinking through far more. When it comes to sort of the actual military fighting, This is really sort of also indicative in sort of how a lot of the preparedness planning has changed over the years. So instead of sort of traditional, fighting with a baton on the end of your gun, people are taking a much more asymmetrical warfare approach and thinking much more through sort of the Ukraine model of how Ukraine has been defending itself. That was really something that Biden tried to push for the last 4 years, was to try to convince Taiwan to sort of change its mind and thinking of how it not just purchases military equipment, but how it trains its soldiers in this kind of way.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Let's take some questions then. We've got a question from Alan M. Go ahead, Alan. Have you got Alan, you just need to open your microphone. You should be able to, on the bottom left-hand side, you should be able to see your microphone. You just need to open it up. There we go.
Lev, thank you. As an Australian, I have some empathy about the scale of the Taiwanese economy and society vis-a-vis the PRC. But in your comments, you so far haven't addressed the issue of what upside there is for China if all it has to do, it seems, in the current environment is do nothing and see the global hegemon vanish from the scene. It's all upside, it seems to me, for the PRC. Why would it be the least bit interested in a military aggression against Taiwan, and certainly not Australia?
So there's a couple of reasons. Again, the PRC's goal is to win over the hearts and minds of people in Taiwan. It currently has not done that. Second, there's still great diplomatic cost and for any sort of change to Taiwan's status quo that the PRC causes. Even though what we've seen in Ukraine has sort of caused the United States to cool off, taking Taiwan or any change to Taiwan would have an impact on the global economy because of things like semiconductors that go far beyond just sort of the United States or Australia. It would impact the whole world. And the PRC knows this. And so the PRC isn't going to take any sort of major risk that would potentially hurt its own status in the world with such a high degree. Combined with the fact that, if it did take sort of unilateral action against Taiwan, how would that affect its own domestic economy, which is currently also struggling? So again, there's a lot of reason why Xi Jinping can wait, and the need or desire for him to need to act right now is far lower. So there are still a couple of important scenarios under which we might imagine that the PRC would take unilateral action. So one, if Taiwan formally declares independence, which is not going to happen. And two, if the world suddenly recognized Taiwan as a formal country, which is also not going to happen. And without these two sort of very clear red lines, it really doesn't, leave a whole lot of incentive for Xi to sort of act. Again, if he really wanted to, he could, but it would be very costly. And then you'd be stuck with an island of 24 million people, which, Taiwan and Australia have very similar populations. That's a lot of people to sort of have to suddenly want to win over with after having just bombed your country.
Alan, do you have a follow-up to that at all?
No, I think we're in violent agreement that the level of risk is minimal. But I think it's an important question to address. But thank you, Lev.
Okay, excellent. We've got a question from Carlos, and his microphone's not working, so I'm going to put the question to you, Lev. What is the relationship, if any, between the TSMC and the People's Republic of China? And why is the new Taiwanese Semiconductor Corporation factory in the US not expected to produce its most advanced chips?
So TSMC has had good relations with China for quite some time. They actually have a factory, at least one factory in China. I know there's at least one in Nanjing. So TSMC keeps its most important chips in Taiwan. For a couple of reasons. One, logistically, like it wants to be able to know exactly the processes and the everyday logistics of their production as closely as possible. And two, it's not trying to move all of its most important operations away from Taiwan, because that is going to sort of sell into this narrative that it has this defeatist attitude that, TSMC is trying to escape Taiwan, or that the government is encouraging TSMC to escape Taiwan. Keep in mind, all of these major deals that TSMC are making with the United States requires government approval. And there's very little reason why the administration would want TSMC to move its most prized products out of Taiwan. So even though they have a relationship with the PRC, the TSMC has been expanding its global production for the last number of years. They also have factories in Japan now, which have actually been, if you follow sort of the story of the production of Arizona versus how it's produced in Kumamoto, Japan, TSMC has had a far more smooth operation in Japan and is likely to keep investing in Japan as well as the United States.
Okay, well, can we turn, if possible, also to the region? And I just want to, I mean, this is briefly thinking about Japan, the Philippines. The Philippines seems to be in an extremely vulnerable position, and China's been far more assertive. Why do you think that is so different to Taiwan? Why is that approach so much different?
There's a uneasy level of acceptance that Taiwan and the PRC maintain. As someone who's not a Philippines expert, I'm going to have to punt that to someone who's better knowledge on the Philippines. But what I can say is it's worth not, it should not be understated just how dire PRC military threats can feel sometimes. So just this last week, the PRC held live fire drills off the coast of Kaohsiung unannounced. That's not normal. That's sort of a escalation that we've seen over the last couple of years. And that's sort of what makes people still feel very nervous about these kinds of drills, is that, on top of Donald Trump uncertainty, the PRC military threats have not stopped. That still becomes a sort of a key in regular feature here. So even though, we see sort of more hot words from the Philippines, Taiwan doesn't offer hot words in response nearly as much, mostly because there's not a lot of incentive to sort of pick a fight diplomatically with the PRC on top of everything else.
Okay. And then in terms of internal politics, how have things changed? Can you see in terms of the impact of Trump and what's happened the last week? Has that had any shift on internal politics in terms of the balance between the two parties?
We haven't seen yet. And I also do want to throw out there that there is a third political party in Taiwan that should be on everyone's radar, the Taiwan People's Party.
Can you also say what the initials are? Because many people are not going to know. I don't either.
Taiwan People's Party. Yeah, let's finish there. So the third party, the Taiwan People's Party, came out in this sort of heyday of Ko Wen-je, who's the former mayor of Taipei. He was the mayor for 2 terms, then went on to form his own political party. Now, Taiwan's electoral system is set up in which small parties have a chance through a proportional representation vote. I know electoral systems are everyone's favorite topic. What matters is that the small party was able to sort of get 8 seats in Taiwan's legislative yuan, which might not seem like very much, but it was enough to control a majority. So neither the DPP or KMT alone have a majority in Taiwan's domestic politics right now. If they want to pass any legislation, they have to work with this third party, the TPP. And the TPP's main campaign messaging during 2024 was that we don't like the DPP. So the TPP's strategy ever since they've come into office has been to work incredibly closely with the KMT. So it's a combination of both the TPP and the KMT that people should be paying attention to, because these two parties are very much working in tandem with each other to sort of block any sort of DPP efforts for policy changes.
Okay, so I mean, what does that mean in terms of constantly? Just explain what that means in terms of overall policy.
So overall, it means the DPP is currently unable to pass policy. The DPP doesn't have a majority, and the majority in the legislative yuan have unilaterally decided to stop the DPP from passing anything. In Taiwan's domestic politics, I know everyone is sort of focused on the United States' constitutional crisis, but Taiwan had its own sort of mini constitutional crisis this last year because of this play out in the legislative yuan. So this alliance between the KMT and the TPP led to a number of legislative changes. They very quickly passed some laws that changed how the constitutional courts in Taiwan work, essentially leaving Taiwan's constitutional court defunct and unable to fully operate. They've also tried to pass a number of bills that would give individual legislators more power and limit the power of the president here in Taiwan. Those were less successful, but at the very least, it shows that there's this strong desire by this sort of large opposition in Congress that is different from Lai's party to sort of limit the power of the DPP while they're in office for the next 4 years.
Okay. We're talking very much in the short term here. We're talking about life during the Trump administration. We did a talk yesterday with a commentator from the Financial Times, in which he said, this is a major global shift. This is not the short-term trend. This is not just down to Trump's presidency. The US is disengaging from the world, is isolationist, and the idea of the Western consensus in which you see allies supported and cooperation between allies is gone. With that in mind, what's the trajectory as you see it for Taiwan?
So it's really a matter of what Donald Trump does with its relationship with the PRC. And that's really sort of the biggest unknown right now. Right now what we're seeing is just sort of tariff fights and the start of this maybe new trade war. And until we really know what Donald Trump's diplomatic approach is going to be with the PRC, Taiwan is sort of waiting to respond accordingly. In the meantime, Taiwan's best bets are sort of still playing out of diversifying its partners and trying to maintain allyships across Europe, trying to do its best to be involved in sort of regional military exercises, but its access to these institutions is very minimal because every time Taiwan tries to participate, it gets blocked. And so, Taiwan is going to continue to do what it's always done, which is try to find effective policies that allow it to maintain its autonomy without giving up any of its sovereignty. In the meantime, all it can do is to hope that Donald Trump doesn't strike a deal with Xi Jinping over Taiwan, or doesn't see Taiwan as sort of just this other card in his pocket. I think that is sort of a very large known unknown here in Taiwan, which is that Donald Trump's attitude towards Taiwan can change very quickly. As you very rightly pointed out in John Bolton's book, he doesn't necessarily see Taiwan in such a good light. How exactly he sees Taiwan, I think, is we don't really know exactly how he sees Taiwan, or how he sees Taiwan changes on the day, or changes on what the last thing he read about Taiwan was or heard about Taiwan was from the people around him. So that's what Taiwan is focused on in the long term, is just trying to think about how do we maintain what we have, because that's what people in Taiwan want, is first and foremost is just peace and stability.
Okay, I mean, to degree, that's sort of crisis management. The quote that John Bolton has in his book is that Trump describes Taiwan like the tip of his pen, and resolute, the enormity of his desk, as China. And so really, the implication is that Taiwan doesn't really matter. But my earlier question was really about the sort of broader trajectory of US influence and or lack of interest in the rest of the world, and sort of focusing on itself. And that if you look beyond you look beyond Trump, the US is going to be less engaged anyway. But I mean, I think your answer essentially is that it is crisis management for Taiwan. You just have to handle the current situation and muddle through as best as you can.
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan's attitude towards either political party in the United States is, so long as you're being friends with us, we'll be friends with you. Taiwan has done its best to try to reach out to both political parties in the United States. So, what comes after Donald Trump, from Taiwan's perspective is, we're here and ready to work with whatever we can work with. The United States continues to be Taiwan's most important ally because it's the only country that sells weapons of a defensive nature to Taiwan. And that was going into the Donald Trump administration. You heard a lot of rhetoric from the Lai administration emphasizing how we are excited to work with any American partner that we can work with. And, Taiwan is not in a position to be picky. We are just here to try to make things work.
Yeah. Okay. A comment from Alan here. Alan, do you want to say what you've written just down in the Q&A box about critical minerals?
Oh, Lev, thanks again. My question is about the source of critical manufacturing materials, critical minerals for chip making in Taiwan. The understanding globally, or here certainly, is that there is control, or the sources of critical minerals for chip making is largely in the hands of the PRC. Is that correct? And if that's so, how does TSMC source its chip making materials, if you know?
So I can't speak to, the PRC's total control of this market. What I can speak to, though, is that TSMC is very intertwined with the Chinese economy. And it's one of these reasons why this sort of hypothesis of the silicon shield has become so popular over the years, is the idea that because of the PRC's role in this global supply chain, especially in regards to chips, and not even just the supply chain of chips, but how they're being produced, but also the chips themselves, that the PRC can't risk a war with Taiwan because of the role that TSMC plays. I mean, it truly is one of the most important companies in the world because of how integral it's become for so many industries in so many countries around the world. So that's part of the concern is that TSMC would be losing TSMC would be detrimental, but that's sort of the silver lining is the PRC also cannot afford to lose TSMC.
Okay, we've got a comment here from Colin who says that perhaps that rare earths are not so critical to chip manufacture; they're more needed for batteries and motors. But anyway, that's not our area of expertise. I think we are. We're going to wrap up, and I'm going to say that our tour, which we will be seeing, Lev, takes place between the 18th and the 26th of October. That tour is sold out. But because there's been so much demand for it, we are going to now run a second tour between the 25th of October and I think it's the 3rd of, it's the 2nd or the 3rd of November. If you're interested, please do get in touch. We have spaces on the second tour, but not the first. So my thanks very much to Lev Nachman for his very precise response. And I think perhaps a slightly more optimistic scenario about Taiwan's immediate future than I had perhaps envisaged. Thank you very much indeed, Lev.